everyone! Today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in 2025. This year was a pretty heavy reading semester, and so I was ending up reading a lot of PDFs, articles for my classes, but here are the books that I read both in class and outside of class too. Of course, since I had so many books to read for my classes, I pretty much skimmed those books, so I'm not going to do a really big in-depth review of those, and this is just going to be a light overview of all the books I've read. There we go. One book that I read this year is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. This book, The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, is really popular, especially on Goodreads. I think there's almost 5 million people that added this to their shelf, and I can see why. This book was actually a really simple writing style so that you could really focus on the content, and it essentially follows an individual who unfortunately loses her will to live, and so when she decides to attempt to end her life, she enters into a library, and this is when she is able to pick all these different books that have different representations or just take her to what her life would have been if she would have made one different decision. And that could have been as small as living in a different town, or as large as she continued to be a swimmer and became an Olympic athlete. And so I think this book really has a very direct message of, regardless of the decisions that you could have made, there's no guarantee that you would have been happy. Next, we have Turtles All the Way Down by John Green. I have not read a John Green book in a while because he usually writes for younger audiences, but I did really enjoy this book. This book follows Asa, who is a high schooler, and it focuses on a really interesting plot where she is finding out that there is a man who is convicted of a crime and he is currently missing, but there is a cash reward for the return or finding this person, and she ends up knowing his son through a mutual experience. And so her friend is trying to convince her to try and become friends with him so that they can find his father and so they can have the money. But the real plot of this book, aside from that kind of scene that gets us into the book and keeps it going through, is actually Asa's perspective. So this character has OCD, and so we see how she's balancing high school, these friendships, a relationship, all of these different factors while having OCD. The book gradually gets more intense as we start to understand more of what her OCD is. The book takes us along from the times that are a little less intense to some moments where she is not feeling at her best. And so overall, I think John Green does offer a perspective that you don't see often in other books, and I think that overall it is a good read. Next, I read You Are Here by David Nichols, and this is the same author of One Day, which is one of my favorite books of all time. And so I was really excited to read this book, and this was one of my last reads. I actually just finished this book yesterday on New Year's Day. This book, I would say, is very calm. It is a romance book that follows two middle-aged adults who both have had experience with divorce, and they are both feeling very alone. They both are isolated, whether it's through working at home after the pandemic and staying home, or just choosing to go on solitary walks. So the one man, Michael, goes on these walks through England alone, and so one of his friends who's really concerned for him decides to bring a group along. And so one of the women in the group is Marnie, who had experienced divorce and was working at home and really just spending most of her time alone. And so she really pushes herself out of her comfort zone to go to this walk. And so we're following these characters as they walk through England, and I really liked the description of the area. You can see each chapter shows where they walk for each portion, and so it's really calming, nature focused, and I really like reading about England and hearing about the area. And of course, the two of them gradually start to become interested in each other, but there's the conflicts of what's going on in their lives. So it does leave you wanting to keep reading more, but it's also just a pretty calm book overall. Okay, I keep moving my camera around, so hopefully that's good. So for my history class, I read a lot of different books, and so I'm just going to list them, but I actually really did enjoy a lot of them. I just had to skim through a few of them, but I did read a few in a lot of detail. And so the books that I read for that include A Land So Strange, Two Princes of Calabar, Blades of Freedom, which is a children's comic book but is actually really insightful on the Haiti Revolution. Villains of All Nations, we read excerpts from that, and then also Murdering McKinley and The Dominion of War. The Dominion of War I read in a lot of detail and ended up writing a paper about it. Essentially, the book is offering a new perspective of telling history by focusing on all the wars that the United States has participated in, and it was an interesting book. It's just very dense, very full of detail, because each chapter, along with focusing on wars, focuses on different people from that time period and tells the story from their perspective. And so it's very dense, very heavy in research, but if you're someone who's interested in American history, I would definitely recommend The Dominion of War. Another book that I read this year is The Ministry of Time, and this book follows a project in the United Kingdom where they are taking people from the past and bringing them into the present, and they are studying the way that they get accustomed to the modern world. I thought this book was very creative in that sense, because you're learning about people from different time periods and how they're reacting to the changes in society and in the changes of the times, just technological advancements. But I will say there are so many ideas in this book, because there's so many different people from different time periods, and about half of the book is going back to the perspective of this one individual who is transported into our time. And so really about half of the book is focusing on their reaction to the modern world. There are just so many ideas that I think the author is trying to introduce in this book. So I would have loved for this book to have been longer so that I could fully understand all the ideas that were introduced and they could be more explained and in more detail. But overall, it was an interesting concept, and it's been a while since I've read science fiction. And then one nonfiction book that I read this year was The Road Less Traveled. It's been a minute since I read it, but it does focus on someone who is a psychiatrist and offers information about stories that he has with former patients while still maintaining confidentiality. This book, I think, goes without saying, has been very popular as well. I also read Mile High, which was honestly not my favorite and not really the storyline for me, but I do know that it is popular. I'm really just moving all my books around here. I also read 3 books by Lynn Painter. I read The Do-Over, Betting on You, and Nothing Like the Movies, which I lent from a friend, and that is the second book following Better Than the Movies. And I would say that Lynn Painter just writes really fun romance novels. They are mainly for younger adults. I like to read these. They're just really quick and fun stories. I would say, however, I wasn't too big of a fan of The Do-Over. I think that if I was younger, I would have liked this book more. I think it's more for a younger audience. But Betting on You, Nothing Like the Movies was so good. I think Nothing Like the Movies is probably one of the most anticipated reads for me, because I really liked Better Than the Movies, and it was following the 2 characters a few years later, or at least after they graduated high school into their college lives, and so much happened in that time, and so you're trying to put the pieces together, see what will happen with the 2 of them, and so it's a really good second book. And I was going to say that I've now read all of Lynn Painter's books, but she actually just came out with a new one called Fake Skating. So I guess I will have to read that and then do a YouTube video reviewing all of her books. And then on a relatively similar note, I read 2 Emily Henry books, People We Meet on Vacation and Funny Story. And I will say, out of all the Emily Henry books I've read, these 2 are probably my favorite ones. I would say I like Book Lovers and Funny Story the best. I did do a YouTube review of this one, which is on my channel. And then I know that there's a movie adaptation to People We Meet on Vacation, which I'm looking forward to watching. I will say though that unlike Lynn Painter, Emily Henry's books are more for an older audience and often follows people in their late 20s, early 30s as well. And similar to Lynn Painter, I've almost read all of Emily Henry's books. I just have one left to read, which I will likely be reading this year. Put it back on my TBR shelf. And then this year I read 3 books by Catherine Center. I read The Bodyguard, Things You Save in a Fire, and The Rom-Commers. And I gotta say, Catherine Center is probably one of my favorite authors. She writes romance books in such a fun way. All the characters are really fun, but it also has characters with depth, and so it's more than just a romance story. And so I think that's why I like her books so much, and also they're just fun. So definitely good reads for this year. And then last but not least, I read Rebecca. It's been on my list to read more classics or older books. I don't think this book is considered a classic, but it is very notable, and I actually really enjoyed this book. I did a book review of it, which is also on my channel, and this was probably the longest book that I read this year. So those were all of the books that I read for 2025, and I thought that it would be fun to talk about some of the books that I want to read this year and hopefully do some book reviews for this channel. So this center shelf behind me is all the books that I have not read yet, and so I'm really looking forward to reading almost all of those books, hopefully, from that bookshelf. And one book that I got this year for Christmas is a classic. It is The Count of Monte Cristo, and I want to start reading more classics, and so this is definitely on my TBR for 2026. Another book that I really want to read is The Covenant of Water. This book looks like it's going to be very complex, and it's just a little intimidating by looking at this book. I've heard really good things about this book, and it was gifted to me, and so I'm really looking forward to reading this book this year as well. And then, like I said, I would love to have read all of Emily Henry's books and Lynn Painter's books. So Fake Skating is on my TBR, and so is A Great Big Beautiful Life by Emily Henry. And then I also have this romance book that my friend gave me called It's a Love Story, and this looks like a fun read maybe this summer. And so those are some books I'm looking forward to reading this year. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it and maybe found some new books to add to your list to read this year. I will see you in the next video.